are joining with audiences from across the globe to enjoy Harrogate International Festival's series of online events, streamed straight from our home to yours. Sit back, relax, and enjoy an interview with John Suchet as part of the Raworth's Harrogate Literature Festival. We promise you've got the best seats in the house.
Welcome to the Harrogate International Festival's summer weekender. It's really great to be with you. My name is Matt Stadlen. I'm a broadcaster and a writer, and I'm really excited about this event because I've never had the privilege of interviewing John Suchet before, and yet he's one of my broadcasting heroes. He's someone who is informative, but also rather informal in the way that he broadcasts on the radio. He really brings you in. He makes you feel that you're in the same room as he is. He's warm, and that's such an unusual quality. It's such a brilliant quality as well. He's also an award-winning TV journalist. He's an award-winning TV broadcaster. Of course, he hosted the news at 10 on ITN. He hosted a variety of news programs on ITN. He was there for over 30 years. He's been at ClassicFM for 10 years. He started off for the bulk of that until very recently, actually doing the morning show. Now he does an evening show. He's an absolute delight to listen to. Very warm welcome to you, John.
Thank you very much, Matt. I'm blushing. Thank you.
I want to start actually, John, as well as welcoming you specifically, very warmly, by asking you about Beethoven, because your Beethoven book, The Man Revealed, has been, well, it's been brought out in a special 250th anniversary of the great man's birth edition. So I'll talk to you about your career and about broadcasting and what it is that you think makes for important must-listen radio. But first, just on Beethoven, what was he like as a man?
Not very nice. And this is something that I struggle with on a daily basis, Matt. He is my all-time hero. I mean, every note that he wrote, I love. I could probably tell you what he had for breakfast every day of his adult life. But I struggle with the fact that had I actually met him and known him, I might not have been too kind towards him. I might not have given him much consideration. He was a difficult man. He had very few friends. Only one friend could be considered to be lifelong in that they met as boys and they remained friends for the entirety of their lives with one or two major fallouts. And interestingly, Beethoven died at the age of 56 years and 3 months. And his friend, who was a couple of years younger than him, died 15 months later. And that friend's son, who became a qualified doctor, said that it was the strain of looking after Beethoven that killed my dad. And I can believe that. He was a difficult man. But then if you were a musician and that was all you could do and you were going deaf, how nice would you be?
Well, how nice was he, though? Because although he could be difficult, as you say, he was also capable of great generosity. And that might not be something we necessarily term as nice. But he wasn't all bad by any means, even on this analysis.
No, that's right. He would be unbearably insufferable and then in an instant become suffocatingly friendly. He was a man of extremes. He wouldn't talk to you and you wouldn't talk to me the way we would if I were Beethoven and you were me, or vice versa. He couldn't hold a normal conversation like that, not least because he was slowly losing his hearing, which, by the way, was a long, slow, gradual process. So he was fighting it for 15 to 20 years, hoping that it would just somehow miraculously cure itself, as the doctors kept telling him it would. But then when this friend I'm talking about, for instance, he moved in with him for a while when he fell out with his landlord. Then he had a row with this friend, accusing the friend of swindling him out of rent. They had a massive row. Beethoven stormed out and went to live somewhere else. And a couple of months later, he was walking across a bridge over the Danube Canal in Vienna, and he saw his friend coming towards him. He said, "Stefan, my dear friend," and hugged him as if absolutely nothing had happened.
I was going to ask you, what do you think lay behind these character flaws? And perhaps the gradual descent towards deafness explains it, or helps explain, because it'd be very difficult living with chronic conditions. But I just wonder whether there's any evidence of these same flaws before the onset of the deafness.
Yes, well, very interestingly, Matt, I mean, the deafness is the main physical problem that he had, but he also had bad health from his childhood onwards. He contracted smallpox as a child, so he had the pock marks for the rest of his life. He was frequently ill, and he had awful digestive problems. He had chronic diarrhea. The night before his very first public performance on stage in Vienna, capital city of music, he had chronic diarrhea. One of his friends from Bonn, his homeland, was in Vienna. He was a qualified doctor now, a totally different one to the person I mentioned just now, and he said, I fed Beethoven thick white liquid to try to cure the problem, but it didn't work. And he walked out on stage. You can imagine, I mean, there are crude expressions for how he walked to the piano stool and then performed his piano concerto. So today, I'm very, very suspicious of post-diagnosis 200 years after the event. He probably had irritable bowel syndrome. He probably had a duodenal ulcer. He definitely had digestive problems, which were not improved by his chronic alcohol consumption. He probably died of cirrhosis of the liver. He would eat gargantuan amounts and then go without food for 24 hours. He would eat in the middle of the night if he wanted to. And doctors used to say to him, look, cut down on your alcohol, try to eat a regular meal 3 times a day. He didn't know what that meant. So he did nothing to ease his problems. So he had all these health problems, but on another level, and I must mention this, from the earliest years, from the age of about 5 or 6, he knew he possessed a musical talent unlike anyone else. Now, he lived in Bonn, which had a little orchestra, which was run by the local Prince Elector. He zoomed up the ranks, and they looked at him at the keyboard and went, another Mozart, we've got another Mozart. He knew it, but it set him apart. It set him apart from his parents. It set him apart from his brothers. It set him apart from his school friends. He made no school friends. In later life, a couple of them said, we didn't understand him. We couldn't get through to him. He would turn up at school looking so scruffy. One of us said to him once, your mother must be dead. No one looks after you. So he was set apart from other human beings all his life. So at the height of his fame, let's say in his 30s and 40s in Vienna, he was still set apart because even amongst musicians, he was so much better than any of them. They didn't know what to say to him. So he was always a being apart. So he wouldn't tolerate anything that didn't fit in with this.
Does it in any way upset you learning that Beethoven wasn't always such a nice chap? Because you think of Mozart and you think of the portrayal in Amadeus.
Yes.
And I know that's upset people in the past, whether or not they think it's accurate or whether they just don't think it was appropriate to portray someone, even if he was infantile, even if he was juvenile and ghastly. It was somehow undermining of his greatness to portray him in this way, even if, as I say, it is accurate.
Yes.
And I just wonder with Beethoven whether that's problematic to you or not.
It definitely is. Just very quickly on the Amadeus, I think they portrayed Mozart perfectly in that he was childlike. He did have a scatological sense of humor. His letters prove it. And so he set some appallingly dirty rhymes to music. He was a bit like that, but he was thoroughly likable. Beethoven was not. And to answer your question, I do struggle with that. Funnily enough, I'm presenting this year-long series on Classic FM every Saturday night, Beethoven, the Man Revealed. And I've reached the stage in his life now where he does something that to me is utterly unforgivable. He had a very strange relationship with his sister-in-law, his brother's wife. His brother died. He then took his sister-in-law to court to gain sole custody of her son, his nephew, and he tried to exclude her totally from the upbringing of her own son. And this court case lasted on and off for 4.5 years. And at the end of it, he was successful, and he said to the boy, you will not see your mother. I mean, his behavior in this period of his life, if I had been one of his friends, let's say I had been a trombonist in his orchestra, I would have said, yeah, he writes great music, but you don't want to go anywhere near him. And I do struggle with that, yes, because he is my hero.
So how do we square that then? Whether or not we struggle with it, how do we attempt to understand this idea that he was an unpleasant fellow? I mean, to the point where you use the word, as you just said, unforgivable in your view, but also you listen to the late string quartets that many think are possibly the greatest music ever written. I mean, it's not so much the melody. They're not easy listening by any stretch of the imagination, but deeply intellectual, deeply thoughtful, transcendental. How do we square these two things?
We don't try to, is the glib answer. There is the man and there is his music. A similar problem, really, a few decades later with Richard Wagner. To me, Richard Wagner's music is utterly sublime. As a man, he was appalling. There's no point in trying to pretend it was a nice man that wrote that wonderful music. And with Beethoven, one of the driving forces behind everything I do about him is to take him off the pedestal, to stop treating him like a god. I have a life mask here in my flat that was taken, well, it's a bronze casting of the life mask that was taken of him when he was 41 and a half years of age. And you see the well-known surly face, but there are laurel leaves around here. That's not Beethoven the man. There's no point in trying to pretend that he was a nice man because he wrote such sublime music. And I all the time say he was a human being. He was a man like you and me in the sense that he had to eat and drink, he had to pay his rent, he had to dress himself, he had to do the normal things you have to do to live an everyday life. And yet he had this quality that few people in history have had. He was a musical genius. There's no point in trying to square the two and say, you must be nice if you can write the late quartets. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't matter that he was not a nice man.
This is just so interesting and topical if we spread this out politically. Because we're in the middle of this moment, aren't we? I mean, not just a moment, a movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. And whether or not you agree with the particular groups, I think most of us agree, I hope we agree with the idea that we need to move very, very quickly to equality, because we haven't got there yet. But in terms of how we relate to the past, we have real problems now, don't we, with statues of this person, that person, and the other. And I wonder whether if that movement were to alight on music, Wagner being a very good example. I mean, some see him as a prototype Nazi. How do we ban the music of Wagner from our personal repertoires? Do we stop buying his music? Do we stop listening to his music? I wouldn't, but I mean, how do we? Yeah, we can't square it, but what do we do about it?
Well, do you remember Barenboim brought Wagner's music into, I can't remember now if it was Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, in Israel, where his music was banned, and Barenboim said, look, we need to separate the man and his music, and he announced that he was going to perform, I think was it the Liebestod from Tristan and Isolde, I'm not sure, and a member of the audience started playing with a football, what do you call it, a rattle thing in the middle of the music. It's a difficult question. I don't believe, as with post-diagnosis of medical issues, you can't call Wagner a proto-Nazi because the Nazis didn't exist when he was alive. However, the views that he espoused were taken up by the Nazis. Can we blame him for that? Well, we can't blame him for that because he didn't know it was going to happen. But we can attack him for the views that he held, but that doesn't, in my mind, detract one iota from the brilliance of his music.
What's also so fascinating, I think, about this is that we're wrestling with not just the human condition. We know that we're all shades of grey as human beings. We do some good things, we do some bad things. Most of us, we hope, sort of somewhere in the messy middle. But what's so fascinating about, I suppose, someone like Wagner is that his views were so particularly abhorrent, and yet his music was so particularly great. And in Beethoven's case, even though we're not talking about his political views, we're talking about how he behaved personally, as you say, that trial with his nephew. It sort of, once you know that, you can't really unknow it.
Yes, but again, I don't believe it should affect whether we love or do not love his music. I'm very keen that the two should not become, we shouldn't think any less of his music because he was not a nice individual. I've written quite a lot about composers now. Verdi, I've written a biography of Verdi, the greatest operatic composer, in my view, who ever lived. He lived in this little town called Busseto in the Po Valley in Italy. His nickname was the Bear of Busseto because he was so awful. And who gave him the nickname? His wife.
Stop telling me these things. Stop it. See, okay, I understand separating the man from the music or the woman from the music in the sense that we shouldn't, I mean, it would just be self-harm, I think, not to listen to this great music. Yes. But in terms of understanding, I suppose, not just the genius and not just the greatness, but the humanity of the music.
Yes.
The humanity of a work of art, when it is coming from someone who is either just a flawed human being like you and I, or more profoundly flawed. Okay, forget the squaring of it. Just try, in terms of understanding how it's possible for this humanity to come from someone who is so flawed. I don't get it. Maybe it doesn't matter that I don't get it, but I don't get it.
Well, it's very interesting you should say that because, you know, Wagner's political views, his views on race, all his views away from music were utterly appalling. Even in his day, his views shocked people. Beethoven's views were actually thoroughly enlightened. He was a great believer in humanity, in the power of the common man and woman. For instance, you know, he dedicated his Eroica Symphony to Napoleon until he heard that Napoleon had crowned himself emperor. He scratched the name off the title page. He's nothing but a tyrant like everybody else. And he carried Schiller's collected poems around with him from his university days. And it's Schiller's An die Freude, that he sets in the Ninth Symphony, of which the crucial line is Alle Menschen werden Brüder, all mankind will become brothers. He was a great believer. He was a creature of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was sweeping Europe while he was alive. The church was losing its power. The divine right of kings was being challenged for the first time. And he, more than anyone, believed in the common man. So I am very proud of Beethoven's personal political beliefs.
So let's move from personality and character. Let's leave all that aside and political views. You're sitting there in the ClassicFM studio every morning. You're broadcasting to the nation and no doubt beyond. And you're encountering all the time this great genius. Where does genius come from in human beings, do you think? And why do you think some have it and some don't?
I have no idea, Matt, where it comes from. And I've often thought, what is genius? I mean, I think it's one of the most overused words in the English language. If a footballer is a genius, what is Mozart? You know, if a footballer is a genius, what is Shakespeare? What is Da Vinci? What is Michelangelo? How many true geniuses are there in history? Probably not more than half a dozen, maybe a dozen. And you know, they're all flawed individuals. I'm absolutely convinced of this. They pay the price for their genius. Now, I'm no expert on artists like Da Vinci, Michelangelo. I'm not a great Shakespearean expert. I know a little bit about composers. They are all flawed. And the more intense their genius, the more flawed they seem to be. Mozart was childlike, scatological. Beethoven, they used to keep a table at the back of his favorite restaurants for him alone so he wouldn't upset the other diners. They pay the price in other areas. They may not even know they're paying that price, but those around them do. And Beethoven had this close circle of friends who protected him. They realized he found it difficult to behave the way ordinary people behave. Remember, Vienna was at war most of the time that Beethoven lived there, crawling in spies. It was really the first police state. You never discussed politics in one of the cafes or the restaurant or in the back of a fiacre. Beethoven did. He would be in a bar and he'd say, the bloody emperor, and at first they used to say, shh. In the end, they didn't care because the spies were, it's just that mad composer, take no notice of him, he's harmless. So they're geniuses. Thank goodness they've lived, but they've paid the price as well.
So I asked you about where this genius comes from. And I like to sort of show off. I know it's terrible name dropping, but about my own ancestry.
Yeah.
And I'm allowed to do it because it hasn't trickled through to me. I mean, I play the piano a little bit. I wanted to be an opera singer, but sadly nothing came of any of that. But my grandfather was a concert pianist, and my great cousin on his side was Anatol Dorati, the conductor. As I've told you before, my great uncle, though not by blood, was Johann Strauss. All this stuff hasn't really filtered through, other than an appreciation and a deep love of classical music. What was Beethoven's heritage like?
Well, it's a very good question. First of all, on the health and the deafness, people often say to me, where did the deafness come from? To which the answer is, we have no idea. I have his family tree going back hundreds of years. There's no deafness recorded in the family before him and no deafness recorded after him. He was a one-off. Why did he get it? How did he get it? We do not know. Now, there was music in his family. His grandfather was Kapellmeister, which is head of all music in Bonn, but he was a singer, which is interesting, and it was very rare for a singer to get that top job. It was usually a composer and instrumentalist. Now, he came from the Netherlands. He was brought into Bonn from the Netherlands because the Prince Elector was there, heard him sing, said, look, would you come to my court and run music for me? Brought him to Bonn, where he settled, and that is why, because of the Dutch ancestry, it's van Beethoven, not von Beethoven, and he was a very, very good musician. As I say, not a composer, but he ran music, and Beethoven, as a child, adored him, and sat on his knee as his grandfather first uttered the immortal names of Handel, and Bach, and so on. But his grandfather died when Beethoven was only 3.5 years of age. He had a painting of his grandfather that hung in the family home. His father pawned it. Beethoven, when he made his name in Vienna, got it out of the pawnbrokers, had it on the wall of his apartment for the rest of his life. He deeply admired his grandfather. His father was also a singer, a court tenor, but an alcoholic, and he was slowly losing his voice, and in the end he was sacked. So there was music in Beethoven's family, but not in any way that accounts for the genius that he had.
But isn't that interesting that he comes from this singing background, given that he only wrote one opera? My grandfather thought it was the greatest opera ever written, Fidelio. Absolutely superb. And the moment when the prisoners emerge into the light, I mean, you can't think of many things more powerful. Of course, in the Ninth Symphony, they're singing. And I think in the Fifth Piano Concerto, they're singing as well at the end, which is rather wonderful. But why do you think the music, the singing was not more a part of his repertoire, given his background?
It just wasn't, and you're absolutely right. I mean, he wrote over 100 songs actually, which are very much neglected. But he once said, "When I hear sounds in my head, I hear the sounds of the orchestra, not of the human voice." And he did struggle to write for the human voice. In fact, there's a passage in the final movement of the ninth, and also in the Missa Solemnis, where the sopranos have to hold the top note for a very long time, and they complained in his day, and they complain to this day. And on the eve of the first performance of the ninth, the bass had complained that his part was too high, the tenor complained his part was too low, the mezzo was deputed to say to Beethoven, "Please may we sing the notes that suit us." Beethoven said, "You will sing what I've written." And the mezzo said to him, "Herr Beethoven, you are a tyrant over all the vocal cords." The bass singer resigned on the spot, so they had to pull a member out of the chorus to sing the bass part. But he struggled with voices. And you mentioned Fidelio. Your grandfather's absolutely right, the greatest opera that's ever written. But it took him 3 goes and 4 overtures. He struggled with it for a decade to get it to the state that we now know today. He did struggle to write for the human voice.
Was he a perfectionist?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm struggling because he was in his eyes, but if you look at his manuscripts, they are awful. There are scratchings out. There are tears in the paper. He had a copyist whose name was Wenzel Schlemmer, who used to copy out his manuscripts for him. And when he died, Beethoven was distraught because he said, he's the only one who can read my writing. And you look at Mozart's manuscripts, perfect. Not a single blotch, not a single crossing out. But Beethoven struggled. Is it because he was a perfectionist? No, because he left mistakes in some of his works, which are obvious mistakes, which have been corrected. He would call stuff back from the publisher after it was published and say, I need to alter bar 35. You can't have Beethoven, we publish it. I need it back, I need it back. So yes, he was a perfectionist, but he struggled to get there.
How do we compare him to Mozart or to Schubert or to Bach? Well, I mean, but Bach, obviously, from such a different generation, a different genre, really, of classical music. But Beethoven, he overlapped, didn't he, between the classical and the romantic eras?
Yes.
In a way, comparison is invidious and not necessary, but it's fun to do. I mean,
absolutely. The first thing to say is that Beethoven greatly admired Bach. In fact, the Wohltempierte Klavier was his calling card. When he first went to Vienna, he could play it like nobody else. And he learned a lot of Bach in his early years. He had a very good teacher in Bonn when he was between the ages of about 11 and 13 or 14, who instilled him with all the right ideas and encouraged him to compose, whereas instead of saying, learn to walk before you can run, he allowed him to compose. So Beethoven's first 3 piano sonatas were published when he was only 13. So he admired Bach. The comparison with Mozart the way I always put it is, Mozart's music is perfection. If you listen to a good performance of Mozart, the music should wash over you and make you feel, doesn't matter what's going on in the world, everything's actually all right. A good Beethoven performance, your knuckles should be white and you should be gripping the arms of your chair. And I'm the first to admit that there are people who would say, if that's true, then I'm a Mozart man. And I accept that and I respect it.
But there are easier pieces of Beethoven as well, the Moonlight Sonata, just for example.
True. I mean, what first got me into Beethoven's music actually was, at first I only knew the angry stuff, da-da-da-dum, the hair flying everywhere, the downturned lips. Then I discovered stuff like the Moonlight Sonata. One of my favorite pieces, my candidate for the least performed and most neglected composition of all, the Triple Concerto. Listen to the slow movement of the Triple Concerto, and you just think, oh, this is beautiful. So how could he do all of that while at the same time he was losing his hearing?
It's extraordinary, isn't it? It's a mystery. Have people attempted to understand how he was able to do it? I guess, you speak to conductors and composers and performers, and they've got it in their head to an extent. I mean, I've said this before in other interviews, but I bumped into Mitsuko Shida, the brilliant pianist, with whose Mozart cycle, the complete sonata cycle I grew up with. And I bumped into her coming out of the Wigmore Hall and asked her once, would she do another Mozart piano cycle? And she said, I think, and again, unless I'm misremembering or misquoting, I think she said, I don't need to because I've got it all in here. I've got it all in my head. Yes. So perhaps that's the way to understand Beethoven creating some of the greatest music ever when he was pretty much deaf. Yes.
One important thing to realize, Matt, to remember, is that he was not born deaf.
No.
And he didn't start to lose his hearing until he was in his mid-20s, living in Vienna, and already famous for his compositions and his performance. It's not as if he didn't know what music sounded like. And in later years, at the period of the late quartets, there's some evidence that he would pound on the keys. He would put his ear trumpet on the keys to try to hear, which suggests that right even then something was getting through, even if it was only vibrations. So he never went 100% profoundly deaf, which apparently is very rare anyway. You're normally left with something, but it's almost certain that a cochlear implant, whatever the cause of it was, a cochlear implant, which has only really been brought in the last couple of decades, would have alleviated the problem enormously. But would we then have had the late quartets?
You mentioned his fame, John. Not all great artists in various genres are famous or reach the acclaim or certainly the wealth in their own lifetimes. I mean, you think just, for example, of the struggles of Van Gogh.
Yes.
To what extent was Beethoven's life a success as he lived it? How wealthy was he?
A lot of money passed through his hands because from the day he arrived in Vienna, he had such a letter of introduction in his back pocket that the aristocrats fell over themselves to sponsor him, to patronize him, and he would perform in their salons. And as a result, one after the other, they commissioned works from him and paid him very well for them. And he was quite a good negotiator. He would negotiate himself with publishers. In fact, he was a very devious negotiator. He was well known for negotiating exclusive rights with one particular publisher, say Bärenreiter, for a particular work, and then he'd sell it to someone else as well. So a lot of money passed through his hands. What he did with it, it just passed through his hands. He just didn't care about money. And when he died and his effects were gone through, there was very little left. But so the short answer is a lot of money came to him, but he was very careless with it.
In the case of Mozart and Schubert, it's so tempting to wonder what the world has lost by their early deaths in their 30s. Beethoven, I think, lasted until he was 57. 56. But nonetheless, we wonder what would have happened had he survived into his 70s. What music might we have got?
That's a very interesting point, Matt. We think of his Symphony No. 9, the choral, as his ultimate achievement because it was the last complete symphony he wrote. He didn't see it that way. He immediately started work on his 10th, and he was sitting in his armchair in his last apartment in the Schwarzspanier house in Vienna. Across the roofs, he could see the steeple of St. Stephen's Cathedral, and he made several pages of sketches, notes, for his 10th symphony. For him, the 9th was the 9th. Now I've moved on to the 10th. Because he never completed it, we think of the 9th as his ultimate achievement, but he didn't.
It's also tempting to wonder what would have happened if there'd been little Beethovens wandering around. Yeah. Why was his private life so, I mean, in the eyes of some, I guess, a failure? I mean, did he see it as a failure? Was he sad about it?
Yeah. He really wanted to marry. He kept writing to his best friends, if only I could find a wife. He proposed at least 3 times, probably more. The first girl he proposed to, quite interestingly, she turned him down. Her great-granddaughter was interviewed by a Beethoven researcher, and he asked her, why did your great-great-grandmother turn Beethoven down? And she said, because he was ugly and half crazy. Now, those words must have come down the family to her, because once he became world famous, my God, she nearly married him. Our great, whatever. So those words had become part of family legend. He's ugly and half crazy. And you can understand it, can't you?
We've touched on the idea of comparison and comparing some of these great composers. You've had no qualms in saying that Fidelio is the greatest opera ever written. Are you equally straightforward in saying that Beethoven was the greatest composer, or does it depend on your mood?
Well, I don't want to be accused of being too dogmatic, so I'll temper what I'm going to say, Matt.
Don't temper it.
Beethoven is the greatest composer who ever lived, bar none. Definitely. For me, he is, I mean, I would be useless on Desert Island Disc. It would be eight Beethovens. I mean, I could listen to Beethoven from morning to night and nobody else. I could. I don't, but I could.
You spend your time sharing music to huge numbers of people on Classic FM. In a way, Classic FM has played such an important role in popularizing classical music, or keeping it alive, introducing it to younger generations, I suppose, sowing the seeds for people to want to go to concerts maybe when they're slightly older. And we can talk about that and the sad loss of that during COVID. But to the ingenue, to someone who doesn't really listen to classical music or doesn't quite get it, can you put into words what is going on inside you when you listen to one of the great pieces of Beethoven music?
The best way I can answer that is to tell you what has been said to me. One of the very earliest talks I ever did on Beethoven, just after my first book was published, it must be 25 years or so ago now, I was signing books at the end, and an elderly chap came up to me, and he leant forward and he said, "I just want you to know that Beethoven saved my life twice." And he walked away. And I don't know to this day what it was. And at roughly the same time, I got a letter from a chap who said to me, he wrote to tell me, he said, "I'm now in my mid-40s. My brother, who was 2 or 3 years older than me, was a soldier in the British Army, and he was killed in Northern Ireland when he was a teenager. 6 months after that, my mother died. So I lost my brother and then I lost my mother. Only Beethoven's music got me through. Now, I can try to explain what they meant, but I can't. Only they know what they meant. But there is some quality of Beethoven's music that inspires, uplifts, enriches, ennobles. You can listen to a piece of Beethoven's music and somehow you feel your spirit has been lifted. The words fail me. That he has that quality to his music that at the end of it, I know the Eroica Symphony, Matt. I've heard it 5 million trillion zillion times. It still takes me by surprise at every turn, and at the end of it, I'm still in tears. And it doesn't happen with anyone else.
Are you prescriptive, John, about how people digest or listen to their classical music? So ClassicFM, for example, it'll be on in the car, it'll be on when you go down the news agents and so forth. You're not one of those people who thinks that you have to sit solemnly and listening to it.
No, listen to it any way you want, anywhere you want. If your introduction to the music of Dvorak is because of the Hovis ad with the boy pushing the bike up the hill, that's fine. As long as you like it, that's fine. None of those composers would object to the way their music is used today. Mozart would have written for the films. He'd be delighted. Samuel Barber's Adagio for Strings in the film Platoon, perfect. And if that introduces you to the music of Samuel Barber, that's brilliant. No, cut out the snobbery. In fact, I've now written, 6 or 7 books on Beethoven, loads of other composers as well. And I set myself a rule, no musical examples and as few key signatures as possible, because you don't have to be able to read music to love it. And that's what puts people off. They say, oh, no. So, in fact, I've had an email on this very computer that I've been using in my Beethoven the Man Revealed weekly series. He said to me, I always found Beethoven daunting because he's supposed to be so difficult. Then I listened to one of your shows about him and I realized he was a bloke. I thought, yes, that's exactly what it is. You can love his music in any way you like, but he was a bloke.
Equally, if you want to go and listen to him in total silence and solemnity in the Queen Elizabeth Hall, because that's how you want to appreciate a late quartet, fine by you as well.
Definitely. Absolutely. Listen to it any way you want.
Now, Beethoven was a composer of his time. And I agree that we should park snobbery to one side, but I can't get around this idea that we're never going to have anyone as great again. And if that's true, and you may not subscribe to that, and tell me if you don't, but if that is true, is that because human beings have become less creative? I very much doubt it. Is it because we just can't? It was a fusion of Beethoven and the circumstances in which he wrote, the musical tradition, the surroundings. I don't just mean physical surroundings, but the musical surroundings in which he wrote, that we're unlikely ever to get anything so great again? Or do you think, contrary to all that we will come back to look at some of the composers of today or 30 years ago and see them in the same sort of, be able to utter them in the same sort of breath?
It's a very good question. And again, it's a slightly unanswerable one. I often think to myself, give or take a few years, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, Schubert, all alive at the same time. Actually, not quite, but only with 2 or 3 years difference. Just think of that. Those 4 great names, practically all alive at the same time. Music was different in those days. To get their music heard, they had to put it on with an orchestra in a theatre. There were no concert halls in Vienna in those days. And that was expensive and that was difficult, and it only appealed to a minority of people. Today, I have every note that Beethoven wrote on that, in my pocket, and every note that
on your phone,
everyone else wrote on my phone. Sorry, yes, on my phone, in my pocket. And we go to the cinema today, or we can watch films on our phone or our tablet or our computer, and composers are writing for those mediums as well. So it's a very different sound world that we live in today. The calls on composers' talents are very different to what they were, say, 200 years ago. Is there a Beethoven alive today? I honestly don't know, but I do somehow doubt it, because they have to do more disparate things now than they did in those days. But it's a difficult question to answer that.
So I want to leave Beethoven behind for a moment, although I'm sure he'll re-emerge in our conversation, and learn a little bit more about you, John. And I'm loath to say this, given that what you said about Beethoven's looks, and you're clearly a very handsome man, but there's something rather Beethoven about your hairstyle.
I have an appointment booked for next week. I have not had it cut for about 6 months. Never happened before in my life. But it is true that it has been remarked upon. My hair is not entirely different to his. I like to think if only some of his talent could have been passed on as well as his hair.
Tell us a little bit more about yourself. Where do you come from?
I was born in London. I'm a London boy, born and bred. My dad was a surgeon. He was a gynecologist and obstetrician. And I have a little bit of a chip on my shoulder that I wasn't able to follow in his footsteps. It's not really a chip because it's not that I tried and failed, but I knew from the earliest days that it was not for me. And I was aware when I was growing up, when I was at school, when I was at university, that my dad's job was to go out and save people's lives. And I remember thinking, I know I'm not going to be a doctor. It's not in me, and it's not what I'm able to do or want to do. I dropped the sciences as soon as I could at school to learn modern languages and arts and all that kind of thing. But what could I possibly do that could ever come close to that? To which the answer is nothing. And I regard my achievements as paltry compared to his. What it has led me to being is an addict for 24 hours in A&E on the television, or in Dad's day, Your Life in Their Hands. They're now broadcasting full operations on the television. I am addicted to it.
I think you underestimate the roles that you fulfill, because bringing the daily news into people's living rooms is a hugely important path that you're playing, or did play. And also, I think just spreading the beauty of classical music, initiating people in something that they haven't experienced before. I think it's really, really important. I ask you this, your brother, someone I've interviewed a couple of times before, including on stage in front of 1,000 people at Cheltenham, a wonderful experience, just such a sort of, just like you, hugely enthusiastic, great joie de vivre, a great love of life, really, that he has, infectious. And I wonder what it was like growing up with him, but also then, as it were, sort of moving through life side by side with him as a brother, who was also incredibly successful in a very different field, most famous, of course, for playing Poirot.
Yeah, well, ever since we were, there's a wonderful photograph of David and me. I don't know, I must be about 10 or 11. He's about 8 or 9. And we're playing one of those football games where, you twiddle the handles,
Yeah, table football, yeah.
Table football. And I'm in my school uniform and he's dressed up as a cowboy. No, he's dressed up as a soldier in the sort of uniform they wear at Buckingham Palace. He was dressing up from the earliest days. And I can remember as a teenager, he said to me, I'm going to be an actor. And I remember Dad saying to him, over my dead body, it's the classic conversation. You must go to university, get a qualification, then you can do what you like. Dave said, no, I'm going to be an actor now. I'm going to drama school. And he did. And Dad, bless him, till the day he died, I don't think he ever really understood what either David or I do, because it wasn't medicine. It was a different world for him. But David and I, it's absolutely lovely. Our paths don't cross professionally. We speak a lot, we chat a lot, and I walk out on stage to talk about Beethoven. We've discussed that. And he says to me, you're a performer as well. I say, no, I'm not, David. I'm simply telling stories in my words. You're a performer. You enter someone's character. You are speaking a writer's words. I'm just telling stories in my own words. Having said that, we both appear in front of cameras. We both walk out on stages. So there are definitely some similarities. But I'm often asked, did you ever want to be an actor too? Never crossed my mind.
Any competitiveness between the two of you?
No, not at all, honestly, because we went down different paths, totally different paths. So no, and we both... We're a bit of a mutual admiration society. I mean, I go to see everything that he does. And he's come to see me in the studio and all that kind of thing. So, we live very close to each other, which is lovely.
A difficult question for you to answer, of course, but we've been trying to understand Beethoven's greatness. You and your brother have both, in the terms of the modern world, been tremendously successful. And I think both thoroughly enjoyed your careers in so many different ways. But what are the chances of two brothers hitting the heights in the ways that you both have? I mean, we see it in sport from time to time. We see brothers playing for the same international cricket team or rugby team. But have you ever given it any thought, modesty aside, what was it about your family or your genes that enabled you and David to be as successful as you've been?
Well, it's nice of you to say so. I'd approach it in a slightly different way. Not to say as successful as we've been, but why did we end up doing what we ended up doing? And it's quite interesting, as I said, that the medical gene was not passed on. Dad was the very first in the family to do medicine, and so far the last. But on my mother's side, her mum, our grandmother, was an actress. She was actually a principal boy in pantomime. And her dad, our grandfather, was a press photographer in the days before television. And in a sense, I've taken after him. I went into television news. Television news was my life. Music is a relatively recent thing. And David has followed our grandmother into the world of acting. So it's quite interesting that mum's genes in that respect turned out to be a lot stronger than dad's. So we've discussed it more in terms of, isn't it interesting how we've taken after mum's side rather than dad's side, rather than talking of success?
Although it's also true that David himself is a brilliant photographer. I mean, he's got a book out, hasn't he? Or bought a book out last year of his own photography, which some of it took my breath away. I was astonished by the quality of it.
And he has Jimmy's, our granddad's, original Leica camera. He was one of the first to use the 35mm Leica. And David and I have often discussed, God, what would he think now to know that we don't even process film anymore? It's all on our phones. He just wouldn't understand that. But yes, David absolutely loves photography. And I tease him because we did the Machu Picchu walk a couple of years ago for Global's Make Some Noise, and he was taking photographs the whole time. And it takes him so long to set the shot up. I kept saying to him, "You've missed it, Dave. You've missed it, Dave." Whereas in television news, you grab it even if it's out of focus. So interestingly, my approach was just get the picture. His is, no, wait, we need to put the lighting here. We need to adjust this.
Brilliant. We'll come back to television news in a second. Here's a personal, but I hope not invasive question. Last time I checked, I think David is a man of faith. I interviewed him once for the Catholic magazine, The Tablet. I can't remember whether that was because he was a Catholic or Protestant, but we're not here to talk about him. Are you a man of faith? And what do you have some sort of life philosophy? You do come across, as I say, as wonderfully enthusiastic, and it's an infectious thing. It makes us, it's a strange word to use during a pandemic, but it kind of helps the rest of us feel upbeat, I think.
Oh, well, that's a nice thing to say. I'm not a religious man, no, and David and I have often discussed this as well, and I respect his religion, and he respects the fact that I do not follow a religion. So I'm not a religious person. I'm often asked, was Beethoven religious? To which the answer is, there's no anecdotal evidence that he ever went to church of his own accord to worship. He wrote very few religious works, and those that he wrote tended to be banned because they were regarded as sacrilegious, because they were performed in a concert hall and not in a church. But he was spiritual. And I would say probably I have a certain amount of spirituality about me. The deeper I get into Beethoven's life and music, I become more spiritual. When I'm listening to it, it gives me higher thoughts. His music sends me into a higher plane. And I derive my religion, if you like, from that kind of thing, from great art. I don't derive it from the Bible or from the Talmud or from the Quran or from going to church or from going to synagogue or from going to mosque. I'm not a follower of organized religion, but I have my own quiet spirituality.
Do you think that we can divide composers between those who were inspired by religion and those who weren't? Do you think there's a difference between explicitly religious music, or indeed music written, as I say, by people who themselves subscribe to a religion?
Very much so. I mean, Bach, everything he wrote was for the glory of God. I mean, he would write it on his manuscripts. He was head of music. He was organist at St. Thomas's Church in Leipzig for the best part of 30 years, turning out religious work, a new work for every Sunday. Everything he wrote was for the glory of God. Bruckner, everything he wrote was for the glory of God. Beethoven was very different. He wrote a couple of spiritual things at the top of some of his compositions. But his religious works, I said, were seen as being not really religious. There's this his Missa Solemnis, his great setting of the Mass, which is one of the greatest choral works ever composed. It was due to be given its first performance along with the ninth in the theatre in Vienna, and the censor banned it because he said, "You've set the words of the Holy Mass. They can only be heard in a church." And he said the censor objected to one particular passage, the Sanctus in the Benedictus, where there's this glorious violin solo in the upper register that floats over the orchestra, slowly coming down. And the censor said, "You are depicting the Holy Spirit in music. That is sacrilege." And he banned the work. And Beethoven said, "What are you talking about? It's music."
Incredible. I suppose I wonder, it's tempting again to wonder whether Bach would have been the composer he was had religion not existed, or had he not been a religious man.
Definitely not. I mean, their lives feed into their music. There's no question about that. Would Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, most famous bars of music ever written, were a direct crib from a French composer. I think his name was it Méhul? I can't remember. Anyway, he was a composer at the time of the French Revolution. He'd written something before Beethoven wrote his Fifth, which is very similar. And Beethoven was inspired. You know, I think it was Stravinsky or one of those who said, "Mediocre composers borrow, great composers steal."
We'll come back to your TV career, John, and your radio career, of course, in a moment. But first, just to mention, I think your father, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your father was Jewish and had spent some time in South Africa.
Oh, he was born in South Africa.
Well, that would explain it then.
That would, yes. He was. His parents came down individually from Eastern Europe in the pogroms, the anti-Jewish pogroms at the turn of the last century, and they, as a family, emigrated to South Africa. My dad was born in Johannesburg, but actually, I think when he was 2, they moved down to Cape Town. His earliest memory was of that journey down. And they were Jewish. Yes, we were a Jewish family almost entirely, except that my grandmother, the one who was the principal boy, was fully Church of England and English. So we're a bit of a mixture, but we were brought up very much in a non-religious household.
Why did you go into broadcast journalism? I mean, you were at ITN for, I think, sort of over 30 years, early 70s, right through to the early 2000s. What was it that took you in that direction?
I was fascinated with news. I remember at university, all I wanted to do was watch and listen to the news and read the newspapers. The Berlin Wall had gone up a year or two before I went to university. And I remember thinking, I've got to go there. I need to be there. I need to see what's going on. And I had this early fascination, which began as a teenager, with news, particularly international news. And the only mediocre talent I ever had at school, apart from playing the trombone, was modern languages. And putting modern languages and news together, I thought to myself, well, I might have a crack at becoming a journalist. And when I was at university in my final year, I applied to ITN to be a graduate trainee, BBC to be a graduate trainee, and Reuters news agency to be a graduate trainee, thinking to myself, oh, this is great. I'll have the pick of all three. I wonder which one I'll choose. Week later, I was turned down by ITN. Week after that, I was turned down by the BBC. Reuters, bless their heart, invited me to Fleet Street for an interview. I arrived at number 85 Fleet Street, this wonderful building, which is they're no longer there. The building is, though. And they invited me in for an interview. They interviewed me. I kept waiting for the language test because I knew if I got a job, they'd send me abroad. They never tested my languages. And they gave me the job. So my first job as a journalist was in Fleet Street. My granddad, who was the press photographer, used to give a talk in retirement called 50 Years in Fleet Street. And he died 2 years before I walked through those doors as a professional journalist in Fleet Street. So I was a journalist, and they sent me to Paris. Again, they didn't test my French. I've since got to know my first bureau chief there really well. In fact, the 2 senior Reuters men who interviewed me, 30 years later, I was with them at a social function, and I said to them, why didn't you test me? If you tested my French, you'd never have given me the job. And they just smiled discreetly. Anyway, I was in Paris as a correspondent for Reuters covering the 1968 revolution, the riots there that ultimately brought down de Gaulle. And I just found myself all the time hanging out with the BBC and ITN crews. I just wanted to be in the front line, filming it and reporting it rather than writing in a notebook. And I made the move after 3 years with Reuters to the BBC. They offered me a job as a writer and they wouldn't let me be a reporter. So I went to ITN. They offered me a job as a writer. They wouldn't let me be a reporter. And then 3 years later, they said, okay, you can be a reporter. And I never looked back.
And you covered some of the big stories at the time, I mean, including the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
Yeah, the Iran revolution the year before. In fact, Ayatollah Khomeini was in exile in a suburb of Paris. And ITN said to me, we think he might be flying, the Shah's gone, he might be flying back to Iran, get over to Paris, see if you can get on the plane with him, which I did with my crew. So I flew back to Tehran with Ayatollah Khomeini and a plane load of journos, covered the revolution there. And then at the end of that year, in fact, that was 1970,
Nine, must have been 79.
That's right. And on Boxing Day, 1979, while the Western world was eating turkey and drinking champagne, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. So I was on a plane to Kabul within a week. And then I went into Afghanistan twice through the front door, i.e. Kabul airport. They then shut that. So with the crew, we then went in from the northwest frontier province of Pakistan, basically climbing a small mountain and down the other side. We never cracked that story. I got some good footage in the distance of Soviet helicopters patrolling, and we hooked up with the Mujahideen, and I did lots of shots of the Mujahideen and, you know, freedom fighters. Many of them then became the Taliban. But I never got to the front line of that story. One of my regrets. Yeah. You
certainly did the hard yards, but then from there you moved into the studio behind a desk. And I wonder what it was about you, and I'm sure the same question is asked of others, like Sir Trevor McDonald, whom I interviewed not so long ago before all this kicked off. And I wonder what it was about you, though, that meant that the bosses picked you out and said, let's get that Suchet into the studio.
Well, the man to ask is Sir David Nicholas, who was then editor of ITN. And I can tell you exactly how it happened. I was a reporter. I had done all these big stories that you mentioned. I had a spell in Washington as Washington correspondent, which did not go terribly well, but that's another story. I then came back and carried on reporting domestically and internationally. And then a new television channel was going to be started called Super Channel, which was the best of BBC and ITV. They were going to cooperate, and they were going to use the latest satellite technology to beam their station across Europe. Now, this had never been done before. No one had ever beamed from London across Europe with text. Now you do it all the time, but in those days, satellites were brand new, all this was new, and they came to ITN and said, will you put together a half-hour international news bulletin at 10 o'clock? We wanted to be presented by somebody who speaks without too strong a regional accent, who's fairly easy to understand and blah, 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 because the viewership will be people for whom English is a second language. David Nicholas, and I can remember the day, summoned me into his office in Wells Street, where ITN was in those days, and I thought, oh, God, what have I done now? What's he going to do? Is he going to sack me? Have I done something? He said, I want you to be a newscaster. I had done a little bit of it on a not freelance, but every other weekend I would present a bulletin because he thought I might be quite good at it, but I hadn't given it an awful lot of thought. But he said, we've been asked to produce this new program for Super Channel. I want you to present it, because when you do into cameras on your stories, I've noticed you are very at ease in front of the camera, you come across, blah, 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 and you're quite easy to understand. You speak quite slowly. You don't have a very strong, this is in the days when a regional accent would have counted against you because, as I say, it's being listened to across Scandinavia, Western Europe and, as we later discovered, Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain. And he said, I want you to be a full-time newscaster. And I actually said to him, and I can remember this, Matt, as clear as day, this was in 1986, and I said to him, can we agree, I don't want to do this, can we agree that if it doesn't work, we both agree it doesn't work, I can go back on the reporter's desk at the same level that I'm leaving it? He said, absolutely.
1986, of course, was the year that you were named TV Journalist of the Year. And then in 1996, you'd been named TV Newscaster of the Year. And I'm curious to know whether there was a sort of different buzz that you got from being out in the field and in the studio. Yes, it's very much so. Television is adrenaline. Television gives you an adrenaline buzz. Television news, because it is always live. And you know it as well as I do, Matt. You've got this earpiece in your ear, they're yelling at you, and you've just got to be calm. I remember I had one disastrous program, and the editor summoned me into his office, and I thought he was going to say, right, it's enough of that, go back on the road as a reporter. And he said to me, the best and only piece of advice I was ever given as a newscaster: forget the control room, forget what's happening, forget what they're shouting in your ear. You are the viewer's friend. You are going into their living room, so you just speak to them like a friend. Ignore what's happening in there. Best advice I was ever given. And the answer to your question is, you get just as much of a buzz. You would come out of the studio after presenting news at 10, just on a high, but you hadn't been allowed to show it because you have to remain calm all the time. So you've got an adrenaline buzz just as you would do on the road as a reporter, but there are no bullets flying around. There are no police trying to arrest you. So it's a slightly safer way of life. Being the viewer's friend is something I guess you managed to translate into being the listener's friend on Classic FM. You said that music came to you a bit later in life, or your passion for it, your love of it. How easy or difficult was it, the transition between broadcasting as a presenter on ITN, doing the evening news, to sitting in a studio showing your love of classical music and trying to communicate that with others? Well, actually, a very slight correction. The passion for it began very early, even as a teenager. The passion for classical music, it was always in the background of my life. And I well remember one night at midnight being on a ferry, leaving Cyprus, steaming towards Beirut, Lebanon, Beirut at the height of the Lebanese civil war, steaming towards the red glow of war. I was the only passenger on the ship. I had a battered Walkman in my pocket, and I brought out Beethoven's Eroica, blew it into my head. So even then, Beethoven has always been with me. Classical music has always been with me. The transition from television to radio was when suddenly they said, would you like to talk about classical music as a career? And it had never occurred to me. Darren Henley, then managing director of Classic FM, phoned me up because I'd published on Beethoven. And he said, would you like to come and do a bit of presenting? And it's taken over my life. And what is fascinating, what really does fascinate me, and I think this will fascinate you too as a broadcaster yourself, television, it really should be more intimate than radio, in the sense that you are, through a camera, looking into the viewer's eyes. They are looking into your eyes. You are directly communicating with them, and yet there's a distance between them. Radio, I once had a lovely chat at a function with the master broadcaster, never been equal, Terry Wogan. And he said to me, the thing about radio is you have to talk to the listeners as if you are talking to a small group of friends in a pub. Yeah, we know all that. Then he said, but they are only half listening. And if you think about it, whenever you're listening to the radio, you're doing something else at the same time. You're driving, or you're cooking, or whatever. You're out for a walk. You very rarely sit down in a chair and listen. And he said, somehow you have to get through to the listener. You can't see them. They can't see you. As a television newscaster, you've got all these weapons at your disposal. Your facial expression, the way a cropped eyebrow can say something, or a snarl of the lip, the shoulders, the hands, how you look into the camera. In radio, you've got nothing except your voice. Only your voice. And at the other end, they're only half listening.
So it should be much less intimate than television, and yet it's not. Maybe it's because, as Darren Henley used to say, radio is the only medium you can take into the shower with you. Maybe it's because you can listen to it wherever, whenever you like, but you get to know the voice, even if you don't know the face. And it's more intimate. The emails that I receive as a radio broadcaster are far more intimate than what I used to receive as a television newscaster. Mostly those were complaints. Now it's to tell me of their love for the music, their stories about Beethoven or the other composers. And that means that it is getting through to them. And I struggle with this, that radio should be less intimate, but it's more intimate.
So I want to hear about some of those lockdown stories before we finish. But first, how do you get the listener to stop half listening and completely listen?
Well, what I like to do is to tell stories. And I now present the Classic FM concert every evening. I've moved off the morning show now to present the concert in the evening. And in a way, it suits me better because I can tell stories about the composers. I try to bring the composers alive. And I've discovered, when I do talks about Beethoven, for instance, on a stage, if you tell them that the Eroica Symphony is the only symphony he began in E flat, and you've lost them already. But if you tell them that he dedicated it to Napoleon and then scratched it off the title page, you've got them. So it's the way you say it that matters. It's the way you talk. You mustn't lecture. People often say, do you give a lecture on Beethoven? No, I talk about him. I tell stories about him. And it's the same on Classic FM. I tell stories and people love stories.
John, what has your experience of lockdown been? I mean, we're unlocking as a country, of course, but as a broadcaster, you get this very strong sense that you're broadcasting you're reaching into the homes of people who might be shielding, people who are self-isolating, people who are unable to leave the house. You're a companion. And doing that evening slot, what sort of sense of, I guess, responsibility have you had on that?
It's a good question. It's an interesting question. The nature of my broadcasting has changed during lockdown. It's become much more intimate. I'm at home. I'm broadcasting from home. So I'm not in a studio surrounded by all the paraphernalia of blinking lights and all this kind of thing. I'm actually in the study at home. And that relaxes you as a broadcaster. And I find that I hesitate to say this, but I think I've improved as a radio broadcaster because of the lockdown. Certainly the emails, I'm getting more intimate emails now than I ever have. And I think it's people responding to the fact that I'm talking to them as if they're sitting in the study of my flat with me. And when I say intimate, I don't mean anything stupid. I mean, telling me what they're up to, telling me their stories to a greater degree than I ever had before. So I think it's when I do go back into the studio, I will try very hard to keep that sense of they're listening at home or in the car, therefore I mustn't talk as if I'm in a studio.
And just briefly, I mean, this is such an important question, but we're running out of time. How worried are you about the future of classical music, given this virus and given what it is doing to live gatherings?
Well, yes, live performance is a worry. I can only hope it'll come back in time. So musicians are doing wonderful things to do stuff on Zoom and all this kind of thing, but it's going to take a very long time for concert halls, for freelance musicians to get their work back as they had. It's going to devastate people in that sense. I'm totally optimistic, Matt. This will pass, whether it's a month, a year, or 2 years, but it will pass, and we'll look back on it as a nightmare time. Classical music itself will survive. My goodness me, it survived so far. This isn't going to wipe it out. And I think people have a hunger for it even more, and they will want that live experience back, because that's what's missing at the moment. There's nothing quite like being in a concert hall where anything can happen up on stage. You're not listening to a recording that's been patched together and made perfect. You never quite know what's going to happen. As I say, Beethoven's Eroica, how's it going to sound tonight? Gosh, it's not a recording I've had 10 years, so I don't know. And that will come back. I just honestly, the musicians who are suffering because concerts are cancelled, my God, I feel for them.
just finally, to finish on an upbeat note, it's difficult not to be upbeat with you, and I realised that I've almost been fawning in my interview. I've interviewed hundreds of people, hundreds of household names. I'm just so excited to be interviewing you for the first time, John, and that's because I really connect to you as a listener to your output. So it's just a treat as a broadcaster to be able to interview someone that you look up to in that way. But just to finish with, sum up your career, because it's been the most tremendous experience, hasn't it?
Yes. It's funny, when you're actually doing it, it doesn't hit you in quite the same way. It's when you look back on it, when I talk to my kids and my grandkids and friends, and they say, "You did what? You met who?" And I think, well, yeah, I did actually. I interviewed a president. I interviewed a prime minister. I've been to wars, riots, revolutions. It's what I always wanted to do. And when I hit the big 6-0 and I retired from television news, I thought, that's it, my broadcasting days are over. And lo and behold, my lifelong passion has become a second career. Who would have thought that could ever happen? So I have an awful lot to be grateful for. And you've said very nice things to me, Matt, but essentially I'm humbled by what's happened to me in my life, and I would never, arrogance is the most awful thing. You will never get me to say how great I've been or anything like that, because you can always do better. And even with broadcasting, every single time you come out of the studio, you think, that link could have been better. I could have done it differently that way. And that's the beauty of it. And musicians feel the same. They will never come off stage and say, that was it, I cracked it tonight. They will always say, there was a bar in the third movement, there was a bit here. It can always be done better. And that's what we must never lose sight of.
Final word to Beethoven, a word of thanks, perhaps?
To Beethoven, gosh, where would I be without him? His music is life-enhancing.
John Suchet, it's been such a treat, as I think people have probably been able to see in my facial expression and in the tone of my voice. It's been wonderful to interview you for the first time. Thank you for your time. Stay safe, stay well. Thank you to everybody who's joined us for this event. We're really grateful for you participating. I hope you continue to enjoy the Harrogate International Festival's weekender, the summer weekender. It's been really good fun. Everyone stay well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. If you have enjoyed this event as part of the Harrogate International Festivals, please do think about a donation to ensure that our festivals can survive in the future. Donations can be made by texting HIF and the amount to 70085. For more events, please visit our online hub, the HIF Player. It's packed with upcoming live streams, events you've missed, archive recordings, and much more.